Hi everyone, I'm Abhishek from LawTech Webinars. A very good afternoon to you, and I welcome you to the second webinar of this series. Today, it gives me immense pleasure to invite our prominent speakers for the webinar. Priya Venkat, Deputy General Counsel, Ribbon Communications; Lara Bleasner, Senior Counsel, Data Privacy and Protection, ARM; and Abraham Mertens, Assistant General Counsel, Arista Networks. So we basically will be discussing, as you are aware, we'll be discussing the impact of blockchain and artificial intelligence on legal professions. We have been seeing a good amount of acceptance from the legal industry on these solutions and these technologies. They have been readily accepted. The legal tech industry is growing very rapidly. The investment is increasing very fast. So people are accepting the changes, are accepting the technology at a very rapid pace. And our speakers will be primarily focusing more on this topic, giving you the insights from the legal industry, as they have been in the industry for 15 plus years now. Just to before I pass on the ship to them to sail, I basically help you understand why we created Lothic webinar. So there was a need to create a free learning opportunity for everyone. So suppose someone is there in the legal industry, has just joined and is not aware what is happening across the globe. This can be a good platform for them to basically have an understanding and basically interact with the top in-house counsels across the globe and help them understand what is exactly happening abroad and other locations. Secondly, staying updated to the global law industry news, what is happening where. Third is discuss and learn what's new and upcoming. For example, CACPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, which is going to be there in January 2020. So this is just an example which I'm giving, where we'll be going ahead with different things that are changing in the industry. And it's a great opportunity to interact with the speakers, to basically represent your organizations and put across some great quality questions at the end of the webinar to give it a more interactive discussions. So I would like to pass on the opportunity to Lara, who will be basically taking the discussion forward from here. And I'll ask the speakers to introduce themselves and take the discussion forward from here.
This is Priya. Thank you, Abhishek. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join our discussion today on the impact of blockchain and AI on the legal profession. As you had mentioned, we're embarking on what's being called the new era of digital trust, where blockchain technology and artificial intelligence are disrupting traditional legal functions. For attorneys to stay competitive in the current legal market, whether in private practice or as an in-house counsel, we need to understand the practical implications of these technologies and become a knowledge resource and trusted legal advisor. There are several use cases for us to draw upon to gain better understanding of how we will stay on top of these current legal, jurisdictional, and liability issues relating to blockchain and AI. In today's webinar, our panel of in-house counsel will explore several topics and draw from their vast experience with working with disruptive technologies. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Abraham, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, this is Abraham Mertens from Arista Networks. I'm Assistant General Counsel here, and I do a bunch of work in privacy and also moving technology forward in our department, and have an interest in blockchain and AI as it continues to develop in the legal field.
Thank you. Lara, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Lara Bleasner, and I'm Senior Counsel at ARM for Data Protection and Privacy. And I do sit on our AI steering committee, leading the discussion around AI usage and then ethics.
Great. Thank you both for your time today. And I am Priya Venkat, Deputy General Counsel at Ribbon Communications. And I'll be moderating the session today, along with sharing some of my insights. Blockchain has been deemed the most important technological innovation since the internet, where anything of value can be securely stored, managed, and transacted upon. Although blockchain was introduced over 10 years ago, today's legal counsel need to understand the future business implications of the technology to help their company stay competitive while also evaluating and mitigating the risk. Blockchain is an underlying technology to create more secure transactions and store encrypted records of ownership. A blockchain is a decentralized and immutable digital ledger recording real-time information, the block, with a cryptographic hash or timestamp, linking it to previous transactions, the chain. Some characteristics include transparency of records, reliability of the data, and availability of trusted real-time information. Throughout our discussion, Lara will be providing a viewpoint and use cases of AI in the legal profession. Lara, let me ask you, how are attorneys availing of intelligent interfaces to process large amount of data in our profession?
So I'll speak to my experience here at ARM, and really how we're using it is to help our businesses grow more with developing the technology. And so what we do is we use a lot of our own data and use ourselves as data subjects. So, how as um, for example, recognizing sort of law's Black dictionary and utilizing that and touching upon it, but giving more than just a definition um, around that. So we actually do use AI to inform our teams that are developing it more so than as a tool in legal per se.
And how long have you been using it? Is it a newer development at your company and that you've seen, or is it something that we know that blockchain's been around for a while and AI even before that, but we're now seeing it in the legal profession more and more? What's that time frame look like?
So I think for our company, because we're smaller, it's a little bit slower. I think for larger companies, it's certainly out there. And then, of course, you've got, IBM's Watson, for example, right? And I think some of the biggest conversations that we have here internally around, privilege and,
So
and what, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, so I think because of all the money that's going into AI research, definitely in this area of how to apply this to legal, and then in various other industries, there are a bunch of startups that are out there pushing AI in legal, and it's just a matter of proving out the case to make sure that we see the value in applying those that technology to our contract process. And for things like NDAs, where the terms are fairly standard, or things where it's pretty easy to create a standard contract, we're definitely seeing a lot of movement in that area. But in terms of moving beyond that into the more difficult or complex deals, I think it's still early days, and we're searching for those use cases and for that value. But it's just a matter of time, I think, before we really build that out and figure out how that's going to be brought to market.
That's a great point. It's been noted that blockchain has the ability to disrupt the practice of law and drag it into the current century, basically, as Abraham had mentioned. And there are many use cases for companies of all sizes to use blockchain technology. One emerging example is in the area of corporate filings with the Secretary of State. It's been said that a corporation is its records, and Delaware incorporates more than 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies. In August 2017, a Delaware state law went into effect that allows corporations to list shareholders and other corporate records on the blockchain. Every corporate document and transaction could be recorded on the blockchain, creating an immutable record of all corporate acts. And this is important for a corporation in an M&A due diligence transaction, where the acquirer receives and reviews the target's corporate documents in a virtual data room. The accuracy and integrity of the information would be incredibly useful in this context. Also, the holding of closing escrow funds and validating the target source code and other IP assets is key to a successful due diligence closure. So Abraham, let me ask you, what are some use cases that you've experienced specifically using blockchain, AI, or both?
So I think AI is one of the things that I've seen a use case for in terms of reviewing M&A type documents, where if you train an AI algorithm to review for certain keywords in proximity to each other, that you can then quickly review and tag documents that need further review. I do think that in the future, as companies possibly move towards using blockchain as a way to track purchase orders, invoices, payments, etc., that you could quickly use that data in a trusted way to be able to ensure that the data that is being presented is actually accurate because of the multiple tracking of validity of data and hopefully lack of ability to alter that data. We'll get into some of the problems later on. I know we're doing use cases now, but I do think it's important to highlight the fact that at this point, as is true with anything, there are security holes that are inherent in anything that's distributed on the internet, and that we need to make sure that we're having a clear audit trail and not just basing our trust on kind of a perception of the infallibility of the technology.
Good point. Laura, any thoughts?
Great point is looking at the technology around this and the fact that it's not, perfect, and it is, subject to, human intervention or what have you. And that's really, when I think about my involvement is really around the ethics and then how far do we take it on that side. So I think there are a lot of areas to explore, but we can't explore them unless we progress the technology.
Those are good points. And, in the hardware context specifically, the manufacturing supply chain, bringing up some of those topics that you brought up, the authenticity and the tracking and the viability, just making sure that there's no counterfeiting, there's no, fraud or risk with, your products getting into the wrong channel. So there's a lot of great use cases for blockchain, but like you said, there are a lot of risks too. So we'll explore those a bit as we move forward. Now, we're talking about technology on the blockchain. Aside from Bitcoin, there is another major use case, smart contracts. And they say that the greatest leaps of civilization occur when we have found new ways to trust one another. And blockchain may be that next leap that will change everything, including the practice of law. But before we get into some of these challenges, we should define what is a smart contract. Actually, they're not really contracts at all. They're dynamic transactions or computer protocols that behave in a set manner determined by their programming. And these automated contracts are programmed to independently execute actions upon the completion of certain criteria or specified events. The terms of the contract are rules-based computer code that allow smart contracts to be automatically verified, self-executed, and self-enforced. The blockchain can decrease the cost and friction of creating, securing, and generating binding legal agreements, and ensure that all parties are dealing with the same version of the document. And as we mentioned, there are challenges with smart contracts. Smart contracts are really perfect for repeatable, standardized customer subscription agreements in a SaaS model. But what happens if an event triggered by the smart contract goes wrong or doesn't happen for some reason? There are remedies for the wrong party. In a traditional contract setting, rescission would be the likely solution, putting both parties back into the original pre-contract position. But this is not automatically viable with the blockchain unless it's programmed into the contract. And because the blockchain continuously changes as the transactions are added to the ledger, there's an inherent characteristic where contract modification issues arise. Abraham, let me ask you, do you see other legal issues with automating self-executing contracts?
So I think one issue that I had mentioned was the security issue. So it would make it a lot easier if there was a hack to self-execute something that had not actually occurred. So if you can create an ability to take over someone's network and there are a bunch of blockchain or smart contracts on that network, say, for example, kind of the current obvious use case for a lot of this blockchain smart contract type of contract is in the financial area where things are very kind of standardized and routinized in a lot of ways, trades and those types of things. But if you could get into a computer that's controlling the execution of those trades, a verification that funds have been received or something like that, then you could certainly trip a bunch of fraud or theft of valuable assets.
That's a good point. And Laura, we were mentioning, just some contract terms and using AI, to help with, dealing with large volumes of information. What are some contract issues that you see that may not transfer over to the smart contract world? And I guess in that sense, would they be
Yeah.
considered binding and enforceable, or, could they be admitted in evidence? I mean, there's so many aspects of this that, there's some general contract principles that may not, match up with smart contracts.
I mean, I think that's true. Maybe over time, that gets resolved. I mean, I think that as I look at it, I think of like the simple use cases. So when I think about the more complicated things, even things that cause us trouble, without the technology, they're complicated enough. So unfortunately, you kind of asked a great question that I haven't really given much thought to on this. When you get deeper and deeper into complicated issues. So I don't know, Adam, excuse me, Abraham, if you have any thoughts about that, but
Yeah,
um,
no. So I think that when you get into complicated negotiations, there's certainly lawyers are trained to have kind of a pride of ownership over the language, and so when you're trying to create something that hopefully can be routinized and speed up negotiation, if I guess here we're wondering or trying to prove out what problem we're actually trying to solve, because when it comes to an agreement between A company and B company around, say, a master purchase agreement, there aren't really so many issues around it being, rapidly replicated or tracked, or making sure that the version control issues are there necessarily in the regular case. So, when it comes to these more complicated terms, how does that fit into the problems that we know that blockchain solves, right?
No, absolutely. And I think that brings us to our next topic, one where, the three of us work in Silicon Valley. We work at technology companies. And we know that blockchain, one of the major use cases, the technology can greatly secure and preserve IP rights through registration and enforcement. Specifically, IP licensing can greatly benefit from blockchain technology. It can give IP owners a heightened level of control over their work. It could show complete chain of ownership through showing sub-licenses and assignments. But although the blockchain can't prevent unauthorized use of copyrighted material, it can help set up terms of sale and licensing of intellectual property that Abraham had mentioned. And these licenses would be self-executing upon use, which would mean that payments of royalties would be automatic, and then thereby reducing any lost profits. And another area where IP could be greatly enhanced by the use of the blockchain is in the use of trade secrets, where companies have to keep this information secret to keep its value. And the blockchain offers an efficient and secure way for business to register and encrypt their trade secrets. Um, these trade secrets wouldn't be available to view. Only the hash or the timestamp would be visible to others when it was added to the chain. So it would be a secure way of identifying trade secrets without revealing its contents, and can be used as evidence in the event of a breach or a theft. So Abraham, let me ask you, how do you see AI and blockchain technologies impacting IP rights?
I think that you're right that this is an area where IP rights can be more easily managed using blockchain technology. The evidence of rights, record keeping, registering and clearing rights, control and tracking of distribution or trade of rights, etc., can easily be done on this, and it's replicated in many locations because of the nature of how blockchain is actually done. So I think that this is an area that can see great growth, and so I do look forward to seeing how this is built out. And one of the issues, I guess, moving back to security, is that blockchain itself is quite secure, or has been resilient against attacks, whereas some apps that are built on top of blockchain are actually not. That their security is an issue. So I think just making sure that if we do rely on a third party or an app outside of the blockchain technology, that we're very aware of security, and including liability for the third party app provider in the case of a breach of security or other fault with that application.
No, that's a great point. The blockchain they say is immutable, but those third-party services could have a breach. It could compromise that. So that's a very interesting point. And Laura, how do you see IP rights changing, either using blockchain AI or just in general, how the world of IP rights and IPR is moving forward in the patenting world, open source software? What are some of your thoughts on the topic?
So as I think about this, I mean, my company's traditional business is we license IP, right? So it will be interesting to see what the adoption rate is by technology companies to use blockchain. I don't know of any current stats, but I think just the sensitivity around that being sort of like the golden egg. Um, is prohibitive for a lot of folks. But I'm curious to see what the adoption of the technology is, and if it's going to be more sort of led by larger companies, and then sort of companies of my size will follow. That's what I'm interested to see is the adoption,
Mhm.
right? Because it is sensitive. I mean, IP rights, especially if that's a main focus of your revenue, certainly you don't want to put those at risk in a technology that's new.
Right. And like you were saying, licensing is, a main part of what your company does. Do you see this being a hindrance or a help in the sense of making sure some of those rote, mundane tasks of just collecting royalties, making sure your third parties are paying the company back and using that IP securely? Do you see this being something that would kind of take the headache away from maybe the IP departments and the legal groups that manage this? Or do you see some more problems in it?
No, I mean, I actually am a proponent of it. So for me, I actually see it as a way to streamline and catch issues before they arise. I mean, certainly, tracking royalty payments and IP usage, I think would greatly benefit by implementing this technology. Certainly much better than, traditional forms of tracking. Um, you know, Excel, whatever, whatever people are using, but certainly, and much more secure, right? I mean, I just think you've got the structure there. I just can't imagine, I mean, I understand the resistance to it. Change is difficult, but I actually think that there's a lot of value to it,
Right. And
and it's
like you were
clean,
saying,
clean
oh,
transaction. I mean, to me, it's cleaner. Excuse me.
no, absolutely. And like you were saying, the risks are, using the public blockchain versus a private one. So maybe having the company have its own private permission blockchain where that
Sure.
information can be controlled might be something that you would consider versus maybe having it out there for everyone to be a part of. And there are issues with that, but maybe that goes back to what you were saying, that trust.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's there, and certainly, I think having the a permission, blockchain is probably the way to go. I mean, I think if you were to do the security and privacy assessment, that's how you'd want to do it. Um, but certainly, it's got to be faster, cleaner than sort of any traditional route, that I see.
Yeah, so I guess an issue that I was thinking about the other day was the application of GDPR and the enforcement mechanism of the GDPR in a public blockchain versus a private blockchain. Public
Mm,
blockchain isn't really owned or operated by anyone, but a private blockchain is. So to the extent that there is any application of the GDPR, and we'll get to that later, how does that impact the decision to go, public or private when it comes to blockchain?
That's a very good point.
yeah, so it's an interesting point, and it's one that I've done lots of data privacy impact assessments on. To ascertain sort of public versus private. Obviously there are advantages and disadvantages, and then certainly, who does the supervising authority then go after if needed. Um, yeah,
No, great.
the
Absolutely.
regulatory authorities. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And definitely we'll want to circle back on those topics in a minute. But kind of, rounding out, IP rights and how we're, viewing these in kind of the glasses of blockchain. Abraham, let me ask you, do you have any thoughts on, the fact that blockchain technology was created, in open source software, and then there are companies trying to patent that technology, or I should say inventors trying to patent that technology, which would create, maybe less interoperability and less innovation in this area. So aside from just being software and having those challenges, do you have any thoughts on the fact of, how we're looking at just blockchain technology from an IP patenting standpoint?
Yeah, I do. I think this same issue, I think, comes up when you get to things like patenting certain DNA sequences or things like that. That on the one hand, I don't want to limit companies' ability to profit from their inventions. But on the other hand, when it's based upon this open source foundation, and then somebody builds a wing based on that strong foundation, and then tries to kind of close it off as a closed wall, I think that can become problematic. So there is very much a kind of each use case type answer to that. But my general feeling on it is that it is problematic in that we do want these innovations and this field to be as open as possible as we move forward and try to get try to figure out what kind of adoption we can get in the general use case field.
No, I totally agree. And I think we have set up our discussion so far to talk about what I would feel is the heart and soul of, what we as lawyers view for blockchain and AI.
I'm sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
before you move to the next thing, I
Sure.
haven't been able to see any of your presentation. If you're presenting it, I'm on this demo. So if you are presenting, it's just showing as a black screen.
Oh, I'm sharing.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
No, thank you.
Really
Maybe the present, Abhishek, if you could maybe help with that. I'm sharing on my end. Thank you, Abraham.
What are the challenges with implementing blockchain technology? So
yes,
this
thank you.
screen I can see. Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead, Fred.
Great. So as we're kind of moving through some of these topics, we're kind of really at the crux of where lawyers, decide some of these issues. How do we advise our in-house, teams, our executive management, our clients if we're outside counsel? So we really have a lot of unanswered questions. As Laura and Abraham had mentioned earlier, if a problem were to occur on the blockchain, who would be responsible? The owner, the developer, or the programmer who writes that code, or a malicious person, as Abraham had mentioned, that might come in and try to steal or create some other theft. And what happens if that contract is wrongly coded? How can it be changed? Are amendments possible? And what would be the legal status of these users, especially if they're not people or entities? And then the other question is something that Abraham had brought up is about private keys being stolen and the security of the blockchain. And how can these users be warned of that? So as I'd mentioned, most of these questions are still unanswered. But one significant legal issue is that once an asset is added to the blockchain ledger, that ledger is indelible and irreversible. So there's no change to that collective ledger until that agreement is meant by all those ledger keepers. So unless everybody agrees to change it on a public blockchain, that will never happen. So this does prevent one person from reversing or correcting a transaction without unanimous agreement. And it solves that issue of untrustworthy users. But it doesn't prevent the ability of an untrustworthy user to hide behind the technology after deceiving or defrauding other counterparties. Lara, what are some legal liabilities or risks that you see as we move forward with this type of technology?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, the biggest one is irreversible, right? So the whole idea that if something were to go wrong, um, there's somebody, misrepresentation or what have you, some type of fraud that's committed, is how do you undo that? And that's been the topic of conversation with myself and my colleagues. And there's, and it's really um, one that causes a great amount of concern, especially from, I mean, for me under, and this is just my niche, is because I'm a privacy person. So GDPR and this whole idea of being irreversible and not being able to change a record, especially if there's an instance where it needs to be for that type of if it's implicated under GDPR, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the right to be
So
forgotten and those types of things are
correct.
certainly difficult when you need somebody else's permission and your company might be held liable for some failure to do something that you're required to do by law.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
And Abraham, you had brought up some issues with the private blockchain. So those are very interesting here as well, because what we're talking about being on the public blockchain, you have this indelible or irreversible, piece kind of supporting that, making everything kind of valid and credible. But on the private blockchain, we have operators being able to change, or maybe even reverse a verified transaction,
Right.
even if it's for good use. That's a problem because you have one person or maybe a few people changing that, which kind of compromises and violates the essence of blockchain. What are your
Exactly.
thoughts there? Yeah.
No, I mean, it strikes at the core of what blockchain is supposed to be about, right? Is this
Yep.
evidence that's created in code where there's a clear chain of evidence related to particular facts that can be captured in the blockchain. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely an issue. And then the other issue, or one of the other issues that we've certainly seen is where the key to a particular hash is only carried by one person, and if they don't have a way of having some succession planning, right, that you lose value. I think that was true for one of the exchanges a couple of years ago, where the owner of the exchange for some Bitcoin, either passed away or had an accident, right? And then how do you get at and continue to administer these assets that are on this blockchain? So just interesting use cases and issues that come up there that I think need to be addressed. And when people are entering into agreements on these types of platforms, of understanding that you may or may not have the ability to recover in the event of an issue. So you really have to make sure that you understand the financial health, assets, et cetera, of the entities that you're dealing with, because often you don't really have the ability to know, or people don't do the research that they should to figure that out on the front end.
Absolutely. And coming back to one point you raised earlier about the security of the blockchain, we're talking about, the centralized kind of culmination of all your assets not being a problem because it's decentralized on the blockchain. But we're kind of talking about these private blockchains where we're now centralizing that back into one person, one entity, one area, and creating a weak point of attack. And then this ownership of assets that can be compromised. So in the sense of security, you brought up technology. Are there other ways that we should be looking at this as well?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the decentralized nature of blockchain in general, obviously you wouldn't want to keep all the information in only one secured location. You want to do multiples, and then make sure that you have regular backups to make sure that if there is an issue that you can revert to a backup. And so that, I think that's just kind of data housekeeping type practices that generally companies should be aware of when storing and backing up / securing their valuable information.
That's an excellent point. And one of the major issues here, as we've kind of touched upon already, is that the blockchain technology knows no geographical boundaries, because these computers or those nodes are vast and decentralized on the public blockchain. And since there's no such thing as a global data protection law, what laws will apply to blockchain disputes? And so this is one that really does not have any answers. As Abhishek had mentioned earlier, the CCPA in California is coming into play in January, but the GDPR is already established. So Laura, let me ask you, how can a system which relies on transparent record of all transactions be made available to all users while ensuring the adequacy of privacy protections for those same users?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this isn't specific to blockchain, because I mean,
Right?
a good portion of my day is spent answering question about the extraterritorial effect of GDPR, and there's a lot of analysis that goes into that, and certainly blockchain is just adds even more complexity to that question, right? And certainly, with CCPA coming into effect and determining, who's who's under that jurisdiction, and certainly other jurisdictions that have various different laws. So it it really is quite tangled spaghetti. Um, so there's no easy answer to this, and I wish I could give one, but it it it's a great technology, but when it comes to privacy implications, certainly a lot of people just default to GDPR because it's the most stringent standard. So therefore, if we all followed that, we'd all be okay. Well, there are manifest reasons for a lot of that people decide not to or take themselves out of the GDPR regime. So your analysis changes swiftly. Um, Abraham, do you have any thoughts on this? Because it's not an easy one, and certainly we're owned ARM here in the U.S. Our mothership is a UK-based company, so we've always looked to GDPR, but of course with Brexit coming up, things also changing, right?
Well,
So
knock wood,
my days are
Brexit doesn't
fun
come
filled.
up sooner rather than later. Like anyway. So yeah, hopefully things will get managed in a seamless way, and we'll see what happens next. But I do have some thoughts about GDPR and its impact on blockchain and the counter cross-border implications of blockchain in general. So, because, as we mentioned before, because blockchain, the public blockchain is decentralized and therefore not really administered by an individual in an individual location. I think the EU Privacy Office has certainly started to think about these issues, and some of the early writings on this indicate that they do see that blockchain information is subject to the GDPR if the information that is being stored in the blockchain qualifies for protection under the GDPR. So I think in that way, entities that are putting information into the blockchain that may refer to other information that may be sensitive, may be personally identifiable if, managed in a particular way, need to be aware of these issues and figure out how to manage the potential implications of that, I guess, would be the easiest way to say it, or liability is another way to say it. So I think we just all need to be aware that GDPR is going to be involved here. But the other issue, and I'm obviously struggling through, everyone's struggling through how to articulate these things and how to deal with them, is that the GDPR requires this right to be forgotten. And one of the features of blockchain is the inability, once a bit of evidence has been captured in the blockchain, to alter or delete that information. So, something is stored in blockchain in order to create the train of evidence. But then what happens if somebody then, under the GDPR, puts in a data erasure request, right? So, if you're storing sensitive information, for example, there are blockchains that, like the MedRec blockchain, that store, patient records, medical records. But if somebody said, hey, I don't want my information stored by that hospital anymore, how do you then, follow through on that request, right? So, so just interesting issues, and I obviously, for liability reasons and enforcement reasons, I think the EU enforcement agencies need to be aware of the difficulties that are implicated here, and maybe potentially create some exceptions or ways to deal with this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point that you raised there. Consent, right? You consent to give the information if a private user is giving that for certain information to be used in a certain way. What happens if, public data mining occurs of that ledger's record of transactions, and that information is being sold or used for other activities like telemarketing? Some companies actually do that. They actually go in and mine public data records, maybe being slightly blind-eyed to the terms of use of that website. And then they use it to gather using AI, machine learning, and all of these sophisticated algorithms to create data sets to either sell or to use as intelligence or to use in products that they sell or solutions for their customers. So how does that work, that idea of consent here? And then having that being an unauthorized practice and processing of the data?
Well, yeah. So yeah, you have companies who gather all this data, and certainly there's the idea of identity graphs and a reliable user and channels to contact them on, particularly marketing, for example, or advertising. Um, and certainly that's a huge issue. You know, in Europe, right? Not only because of GDPR, but certainly, you have the um, IAB framework set up to sort of, have a consent mechanism or appropriately gather consent. And then when consent is withdrawn, it's like, the right to be forgotten, right? How do you get that back in blockchain? So I think that's the other issue. And then certainly a blind eye to terms of use on a website to sort of data mine. I think another area where you see a lot of action being taken in France, for example. They're very active of prosecuting actors who are doing that. So it'll be interesting to see how that all pans out.
Abraham, do you see anything here in the sense of these further breaches that occur? Kind of takes it even beyond what the GDPR and CCPA would say. What are your thoughts here about just the consent issue being, I guess, challenged in the sense of, and how do we regulate that?
Right. I think you're absolutely right in bringing this to the fore. Is that we require that people have informed consent of their use of their data. And so to the extent that this data can be scraped or mined or used for purposes that are not intended or clearly articulated to users on the front end, you create a problem there. I think, it's incumbent upon governments to step in and actually do the work to create liability and create laws to protect consumers and create liability, individual if necessary, for these bad actors. But it is very difficult because a lot of this stuff is done, or potentially by criminal organizations or entities that are not easy to hold liable in any useful way.
Oh, that's a good point. And, we're looking to legislators, we're looking to the courts to define it. What can we do, as in-house counsel in the sense of, if our products have to be compliant with, let's say, the GDPR? We hear about, data protection by design and data protection by default. By design is actually making sure we use encryption or pseudonymization inside the product, inside that solution that our companies are selling. But by default, is this what you guys were talking about, this data minimization or retention issues, how long we keep that, stored on the blockchain? And if we were to kind of figure out ways to automate this right to be forgotten or erasure, like you called it, when do we decide and how do we define that, that business purpose for what it was first collected for? And how do we, take this outside of just for consumers, if we just want to have a general kind of plan of action for privacy and data retention policies at our companies? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really important for us to question and to create kind of a company hypothesis or guiding principle around data and how data is stored, used, et cetera, and making sure that that guiding principle protects not only the company, but the general public at large, because it is, as is true with so many things, uh, the collective action of small actors leads to the potential for either a good outcome or a very poor outcome.
It's a good point. Laura, do you have any thoughts on privacy by design? If that's something that, we as companies should be looking at in a different way now that we have blockchain and AI technology out there that's changing, how it's being used and also how lawyers have to kind of react and respond to this?
Um, yeah, I mean, I actually think that privacy by design and default are coming more into, view. I mean, I talked to privacy engineers about this, and it is one control mechanism. I mean, I think one thing is, people look at getting this data, and then I think it becomes stale rather quickly because it changes a lot. but keeping it doesn't help anybody either. It becomes a liability as opposed to an asset. So, I mean, I think that those are all, things that need to be looked at: privacy by design and default, and records retention, and purging, and whether you anonymize it or anonymize it. Excuse me, goodness, that's a tongue twister. That those are all viable things to do. I mean, what happens in the case where your contracts say that you return your customers' data and they're in the
Right.
blockchain? Yeah,
Right.
Right.
right. So.
That's a great point. And like we said, in the beginning, all of these topics that we've talked about today really don't have concrete answers. Discussions like this to bring these to the forefront, to understand, what we can do to help our company stay ahead of this is all we can do. Looking and mitigating this risk, but also making sure, as in-house counsel specifically, we help our companies actually, compete in the marketplace and use these new technologies to drive new business. And just some final takeaways here. I read something very interesting, that the mining of the blockchain for gathering all this information uses the energy equal to the country of Denmark. So what we're talking about here is massive. Even if we could try to hone the algorithms and, consume less energy, it's not an easy task. There's a lot of security and privacy that's built into the blockchain. But as we've talked about today, on a private blockchain, some of that goes out the window. Also, there are, a lot of good reasons for a company or even a private citizen to have a personal blockchain. I just know, from my own life, just collecting things. If you, take the bar exam in the United States, you have to go through this moral character and fitness review, and you have to pull references in every place you've lived and all the other states that you're licensed. So in a sense, having this recorded on a blockchain makes your life a lot easier as you're trying to prove your digital identity. So there's a lot of good uses for it. I think it was raised earlier, in the medical context, having medical data stored securely, having HIPAA laws have a little more teeth in that sense. There's a lot of great reasons for it.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
there's the other side of this. There's the other side of this as well, which is people make mistakes when they don't think that things are going to last forever. There's all these discussions around, what if there was social media in the 80s or 90s or 60s, when alleged things were occurring with various politicians, or mores were different, and then now how would those things be viewed? Plus, what do you do in a country where there's a repressive regime, where all the information is stored and then can be accessed because it can't necessarily be deleted or forgotten? So I just think that there are a lot of other implications as well, in the privacy aspects of this, that we need to think about.
Right. And Laura, what do you see for the future of AI in the legal profession? What do you see as kind of the next steps? What do you see as some of the major challenges or some of the major boons that we'll be seeing as you speculate and look into that crystal ball that you have?
Yeah. So when I think about AI, especially in the legal area, I mean, I think one of the biggest things is, not just the ethics around it, but actually, I guess, shifting the view on AI. I mean, people see it as so intrusive, and I don't deny that, but I think that there has to be sort of a shift that, privacy isn't dead. It's just, what is it? It's just not, distributed equally, right? So, I mean, I think that it's a personal thing, but I think AI can be used, for the greater good, and certainly for in the legal area. I think we need to think about the ethical challenges that presents to us as attorneys. And I think those are the biggest areas. I mean, the technology will continue to improve, but I think we have input into that as attorneys, to make that, um, viable for people to use, right?
Yeah. We've reserved some time for questions from our audience today, and our panelists would welcome those now if we're ready for that.
Question from one of the attendees. Probably he is not able to connect properly, so he has sent me the question. So the question basically is how effective it is to implement blockchain if the size of the database is very big. So in case of big data, which the organizations mostly deal with, how effective it is to implement blockchain, and if you can give an idea on the cost, kind of cost involved to implement a blockchain system in the organizations. So what kind of investment the organization needs to make, if any of your organization which you're currently serving, which you have served in past, have you implemented any of these solutions?
Well, I know for the cost itself, we're not, none of us are legal vendors, so I don't think we would know the specifics of that. But I can say from kind of the time and the effort, I think one of these things, it is an effort both from legal and from your engineers to do it
Mhm.
together. The coding of a lot of this, a lot of the underlying algorithms are there for our technical experts, but I think legal has to also be there. So I think looking at it from a cost perspective, it is a multidisciplinary project in any company. And Abraham, let me ask you, aside from the actual cost of implementing it, I think when we're talking about big data and AI and even now blockchain, it does take a lot of resource, like we had mentioned. But what are some of those kind of challenges if your execs were to come to you and ask you, how do we implement this? How would you kind of advise, and where would we start this?
Well, so the variability and changes to the blockchain that is being stored, I guess, would be the issue that is one of the major cost drivers. So if the blockchain doesn't have a lot of activity on it, right, then your upkeep costs after an initial investment in setting up the blockchain could potentially be lower, I think. But to the extent that it's an actively used blockchain, there's, as we had mentioned, a lot of energy and other um, issues around use. So, um, we'd have to, obviously, as is true with any project, explore the use cases, explore the types of issues that we're trying to solve for, and then go forward figuring out the best way to solve those problems.
It's a great point. And I think, maybe to, top that off, public versus private would definitely determine the costs. As Abram had said, if it's private, obviously your company is going to be taking on a lot more to set it up and monitor and use it. You'll have operators. The public blockchain is really kind of just literally coding those contracts, even like a smart contract, almost automatically record those mundane type of transactions. So the cost would be definitely different based on how you want to create that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay,
Anything
thank
else?
you. Yeah, one more question we have from one of the attendees. So he probably is asking about how blockchain helps in planning being compliant to GDPR, because the particular question probably can be reframed as basically how blockchain can help ensure data protection at the same point of time. Basically, being compliant to GDPR to not let have cyber security threats that can be the attacks that can be done on the systems. So how to safeguard on both the aspects by implementing blockchain and being compliant to GDPR.
Well, the blockchain itself doesn't necessarily
Right.
make sure that you're compliant with GDPR. You still would need to implement a full policy around that. Uh, and then I guess the other part of the question was around security. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think we've discussed the security of blockchain in general, like the blockchain technology in and of itself is fairly resilient. But then when it comes to applications that allow you to interface with a blockchain, that you're building out using the information that you're adding, that application itself needs to be tested for security and resilience, et cetera. So, um,
Right.
Yeah. So I believe these were the two questions that were there from the attendees. They have not shared much of the questions on that part. So I would basically like to take this opportunity to thank the speakers for taking out time from the busy schedules and from giving us their insightful information about the particular topic, how it is working in sync with GDPR, how blockchain is going to be there in the coming years, and how the organizations are adopting it, how the blockchain and AI are the next thing to look up in legal industry. So thank you, Abraham, thank you, Lara, thank you, Priya, for taking your time. I believe
Great.
Thank you,
Thank you
this
all.
Abhishek.
was a
Thank
great,
you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you,
insightful, and
Abraham, for
comprehensive
sharing your time
sessions.
with me and your insights.
For the, yeah,
And thank you
yeah.
to all the attendees. Appreciate it.
So
Okay.
we just
Thanks, everybody.
thank you so much. So we'll be concluding the webinar here. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day ahead.
So Abhishek, is it just you and I now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Very good. All right. So we should just jump, close down and everything's done? Or are we going to have a wrap up with the
Oh no,
presenters?
it's just the close down.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank
Very good.
you, Abraham. Thanks for your
Okay.
time.
A pleasure.
Wish you a
Thanks.
great day
Bye.
ahead. Yeah, let's connect forward for the upcoming webinars in the next month. I'll probably share the details with you. We'll catch up soon on
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Sure, sure.
Thank you so much.
In terms of recording and posting this, do you do that or I forget?
I'll do that. I'll do that and share the link of the
Okay.
YouTube channel that we have, so you can
Okay.
basically promote that across your network.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Sure.
Thank you. Have a
Thanks.
nice
Bye
day.
bye.
Bye.